Flicka by Mary O'Hara. Chapter 15. Ken lay face down on the pine needles under the trees on the hill over the green. His chin was propped in his hands. Looking down, he could see the green and the house. Now and then he could hear voices from the kitchen. Howard was in there with their mother. He was telling her about what had happened when they brought Flicka in. They were getting dinner. It wouldn't be long before it was time to eat. He wished he didn't have to go down at all. Howard would watch him. His father would ignore him or glare at him. And if he looked at his mother, that would be the worst of all. The dogs were both on the terrace. It was a hot, sultry day, and Tim and Gus were putting the awning up over the pergola. Nell had been saying for several days it was time to put it up. The sun was getting too strong. Ken watched them working at it. Tim up on the roof, Gus on the terrace, pulling it and straightening it over the lattice. Tim nailing it in. Ken couldn't figure out what was going to happen. Was he going to get the filly? She was his. No one had questioned that. But would they be able to get her? Would there perhaps be several more efforts like this morning's? And then would they give up? And would his filly be forever out there on the range? Wild, alone, free, not friends with him at all. And his father, not friends either. Everything was a mess. The summer spoiled. Howard with Highboy, crowing over him more than ever. There was the sound of a car coming. And looking off between the trees, Ken saw a long, grey, smart-looking car coming around the bend of the road. It tooled along. Over the bridge, finally across the cattle guard and up behind the house. He wondered who it was. His father was already coming out of the front door onto the terrace, and now, around the end of the house, the visitor appeared. Ken couldn't make out who. A very tall man, not a rancher, with a wide felt hat, and his father held out both hands and gave him a loud and noisy welcome. Perhaps it was an officer from the army post. Nell came running out of the house with her apron on, and there were very jolly greetings again. And then Howard came, and Ken could see him introduced and shaking hands. They talked for a while, then pulled up chairs on the terrace and sat down. His mother went back into the house. Gus and Tim had finished putting up the canvas and went towards the bunkhouse. Howard sat on the terrace wall, close enough to hear what they were saying, and played with the dogs. Ken felt very out of it all. He wondered if the stranger was going to stay to dinner, then forgot him again thinking about Flicka. He put his head down on his arm. There was a fly somewhere near. One of the summer racing flies. They raced and raced around you in circles, never went very far away. They were always there underneath the pines. Though they weren't really nice, the sound of them made you happy, because they went with summer and hot sun and pine needles. He poked with a stick at the pine needles, digging a little hole. There were some ants running in and out of the needles, very busy. He put his stick in the way of an ant and watched the ant crawl over. Then he shook it off, put the stick down again, and again the ant crawled over. He could keep on doing that all morning, he thought, and 100 times the ant would crawl over the stick and still not be getting anywhere. Flicka, how was she feeling? Would she remember them? Would she hate them all, himself too? People always said horses never forgot. She had a lot of bad things to remember, Banner chasing her and biting her, then being driven into the corral, and the way she got hurt and scratched when she crawled out. The bell was ringing. He roused himself and looked down. Nell had sent Howard to the spring house to ring the big locomotive bell which hung in an iron frame at the very top of the peaked roof of the spring house. His father had bought the bell from the railroad. It was bright brass and lined with scarlet, and a wire was attached to it which hung down over the roof to the ground. There was a little wooden handle on the end of the wire. You could ring the bell by holding the wooden handle, getting a good swing going with your arms, and pulling it rhythmically. And when the bell got going, it sounded all over the ranch, up at the stables and down in the meadows. Howard was ringing for him. They didn't know where he was. Ken got up, ran down the hill, crossed the green, and went in through the kitchen so he could wash his hands and slick his hair down. His mother was there, and she seemed a little excited. "Mr. Sargent is here, dear. He's going to stay for dinner, and we're eating in the dining room. You boys will help me." In a moment, Ken was on the terrace, shaking hands with Charlie Sargent, and his father's arm was across his shoulder, and he was saying, "And here's the other one. I've got a couple of jockeys, you see." And Charlie Sargent, whom he remembered now, was shaking hands with him warmly, and he was looking up into the long, humorous face under the big sombrero. And suddenly he felt much better, because everyone seemed to have forgotten about Flicka, or that he was in disgrace again. They had a fricassee of some cottontails he and Howard had shot yesterday evening, and his mother had cooked them with a border of fluffy white rice, and a sauce of mushrooms and cream. And Charlie Sargent kept raving about the bread and asking for more and more of it, and saying he never got anything but bakery bread at home, and had thought bread baking was a lost art in Wyoming. Howard and Ken didn't say very much, but the three grown-ups talked, and it was very interesting, because everything Charlie Sargent said, he said in a funny way that made them laugh. They were talking about something very exciting. The shipping of a carload of horses from Sargent's ranch down to Los Angeles, for a man there to sell on assignment to a polo club. There was space enough in the car for 4 more horses, and Sargent wanted to know if McLaughlin wanted to go in with him on the deal, pay part of the shipping expenses, and ship 4 horses. Ken looked at his father and could see that he was in the best humor, his eyes blue and flashing, and his big white teeth laughing in his dark face. And his mother was happy too. Her hair brushed so smooth and sleek down over her forehead, and her eyes, that were the same color as the dark purple iris in the bowl on the center of the table, wide open and smiling, and dimples in her cheeks. And she had a funny, gay remark to make to everything Charlie Sargent said. So soon they were all shouting, the boys laughing too. After dinner, McLaughlin took Sargent into his study, and Ken and Howard cleared the table while their mother washed the dishes and tidied up the kitchen. And it was while they were doing that they heard their father talking about Rocket. The men were sitting with tall glasses and a bottle of scotch, and McLaughlin was shouting, "I'm telling you, with all your racehorses, you've got nothing like this. A bronc, unbroken, nobody's been able to break her, but I can show you that she-devil running like nothing you've ever seen, 25, 28, 30 miles an hour." Ken carried a tray of plates into his mother and said to her, "Dad's telling him about Rocket." Nell went to the door and stood listening a moment, her dish towel over her shoulder and a dripping glass in her hand. Rob and Sargent were both laughing and shouting now, "You're crazy. I'm telling you, there ain't no such animal. What'll you bet? If I could get a mare that could do 28 without training, if you can break her, she'll make a fortune for you on the track. I've got a bronco buster can break any horse that was ever foaled, except Rocket. But if you can't break her, you can get racehorses out of her. Jake can break her, I tell you, if she's worth breaking. Worth it, didn't I tell you? Can she really do 30 an hour? I'll sell you to her cheap. How much? 500 I'm asking. How fast did you say? Got a stopwatch? I've got a speedometer." Everything was forgotten except running Rocket and timing her. And before Nell had finished going over the dining room rug with the carpet sweeper, McLaughlin was out shouting for Ross and Gus, and they were all up at the stable saddling up to bring in the brood mares. "Bring 'em all," said McLaughlin. "I won't take the chance of bringing her in alone. I need Banner to help me." Sergeant, in his smart tweed business suit and his tan Oxfords, and a big sombrero on his thin grey hair, rode Shorty. As luck would have it, the broodmare bunch were not very far away on the saddleback, and before the afternoon was half over, they were all in the corrals, milling around, Banner very curious as to why they were in, keeping his eye on McLaughlan. Rocket was wild-eyed and jumpy as usual, especially when she found herself singled out, separated from the others, and all alone in the small corral. "Why, the necklace," said Sergeant. "Is that a mark of special distinction?" But while he spoke, he was walking around the mare, eyeing her shrewdly, noticing the great width of chest, the wide flaring nostrils, the long springy hocks. She was a little too high in the haunches, and too long in the body. He didn't like her eyes or the way she held her nose up. Rob was ashamed of the old piece of rope around her neck. "I've been intending to get that off her. Now's a good time." Rob laughed. "I've told you, she's a hellion. I'm likely to lose my life trying to get that rope off. I'd rather sell her first." McLaughlan decided to run Rocket in the stable pasture, along the strip of level grass just inside the fence of the county road. He went down to the house and everyone got into the big Studebaker, Nell and the boys in the back, and Sergeant beside Rob in the front. They drove back up to the stables, and Ken got out and opened the gate into the stable pasture. The car waited for him until he had closed it, and he hopped in again. Gus was waiting inside the corral, and when McLaughlan called to him to let Rocket out, he opened the gate, and the big mare walked slowly out alone, and stood looking around, as if wondering why the others were not coming too. McLaughlan had stopped the car. Now he started it heading for Rocket. She moved off in the right direction. The Studebaker followed. She broke into a trot, and her head came up, and her ears pricked with excitement. McLaughlan's foot pressed heavier on the throttle. The mare gave no sign of making increased effort, but kept her distance easily. Suddenly, she shied out to the side. McLaughlan swerved and circled to drive her back to the fence, but she had another idea in her head. She shot off to the woods with such speed that in a moment or two she disappeared from sight. McLaughlan cursed freely, but followed, dodging in and out of the trees and finally taking one of the little trails that led down to Deer Creek. They caught sight of the mare again as the car forded a shallow place in the stream. She was emerging from the aspens on the other side, and soon, on the hillside, came up against the fence which was the northern boundary of the pasture. She turned and trotted along beside it. McLaughlan, noticing the way she kept hesitating and looking over the fence, said, "She's thinking about Castle Rock Meadow again." The mare came to a pause, and McLaughlan stopped the car, watching her. Suddenly the mare lifted her forefeet, and without taking the trouble to jump, crashed through the fence, tearing the wires, plunging on in spite of the barbs caught in her hide. In a moment she had disappeared in the woods on the other side. At such a time McLaughlan drew on the store of profanity accumulated during his years of service in the U.S. Army. Charlie Sargent was laughing. "She's on her way back to Castle Rock Meadow," said Rob. "She lost a colt there a couple of weeks ago and can't get it out of her head. She'll go through every fence. More work for Gus or me tomorrow. Here, Howard, get out and mend that wire." He pulled a pair of pliers and wire cutters from the pocket of the car and handed them to Howard. The boy jumped out, haunted around the fence posts until he found a loose piece of wire, cut it to the needed length, and drew up the broken ends and fastened them together with the short piece. "Now," said Rob, "we'll surprise her by meeting her at the aspen grove. She'll be there ahead of us. Hold tight, everybody." They bumped through the woods, following narrow paths that bored through what seemed impenetrable greenery, growing lush and thick down here by the stream. They twisted around tree trunks and stones, finally emerging from the woods on an open hillside covered with low scrub and sage, and ran along this at so tilted an angle that the car seemed about to turn over. But when they finally reached the aspen grove, Rocket had made her investigations and put the matter from her mind. She was grazing calmly on the range above the meadow. She had gone through over 3 fences to get there. McLachlan was elated. She's not far from the road that leads home over the North Range. It's the flattest ground anywhere around. If she decides to go back to the corrals, she's likely to take that way. He circled up slowly behind the mare. She paid no attention. He tooted the horn. Rocket hated the horn. She looked nervously around for a moment, then headed for home with the car behind her. It was perfect ground for a workout. No one in the car spoke now. They were intent on watching the mare. She had at last broken into a canter. Every reach took her much farther than the reach of most horses, but the astonishing thing about her was the complete lack of effort. She seemed to float along. Ken remembered, with such inner rapture that it almost choked him, that Flicka had the same effortless, floating gallop. Where was this hidden power in them? Perhaps the 2 high haunches, the slight extra length of body? Ken and Howard and Nell were all hanging over the back of the front seat. "Great guns," muttered Sergeant. "She's like a locomotive. Does she always run with her nose up in the air like that?" "Yes," said Rob. "Stargazer." "Get going," said Sergeant. "She's not half trying." "Look at the speedometer," said Rob. "Jumping Jehoshaphat," said Sergeant. The car went faster. The speedometer touched 30. The mare appeared to be trying no harder, but kept her distance easily. When Rocket reached the road which led in from the highway, she turned, going towards the house, McLachlan after her. "One more burst of speed now," cried Charlie Sargent. "If that speedometer goes over 30, I'll buy her." "Without even trying," scoffed Rob, pressing his foot on the throttle and hitting the horn. At the sound of the horn, the mare bounded forward. Sargent kept one eye on the mare and one on the speedometer. It was climbing 30, 31, 33, and was wavering just short of 35 as she thundered over the little stone bridge and started up the last stretch towards the green. "The cattle guard! Dad!" yelled Howard. McLachlan did not abate his speed, nor did Rocket. When she came to the cattle guard, her reach was longer, her body rose higher, but still apparently without effort. She floated over the 15-foot broad jump as if it had been the creek. Rob and Sargent went to have some more drinks, and an hour later the bargain was concluded. He would buy Rocket for $500, delivered at his ranch, sound in wind and limb. "And just how you'll do that, me lad," he said, grinning, "is anybody's guess." "Leave it to me," said Rob boastfully. Also, Rob would complete the breaking and training of the 4 3-year-olds and have them ready to ship in 10 days to Los Angeles in Sargent's carload of green polo horses. And so the profitable and exciting afternoon ended, and Sargent drove away. At supper, every incident of the day was talked about, even the cottontail fricassee, and Nell's bread, and how pretty the table looked with the purple iris in the centre bowl, and the way Charlie Sargent looked at Nell and paid her compliments and kidded Rob. After supper, the boys went out with their 22s to get more cottontails, and Rob and Nell sat on the terrace and enjoyed the evening. There was a magical clear light over the world that seemed to emanate from the soft indigo of the sky. Right over the hill opposite the green was one golden star. It twinkled coquettishly, and not very far off in the sky a single coiled mass of white cloud winked back. The cloud was full of lightning, and went on and off like an electric light. For as long as 10 seconds it would flash into illumination, filled through and through with rose and gold light, then would blink a few times and go out, rumbling softly. The star twinkled merrily back. Nothing else in all the twilight world moved. It was as if everything watched the little play between the star and the cloud. At last the sky was crowded with stars, and the cloud, grumbling and flashing intermittently, moved off and disappeared behind the hills. The boys went down to the meadow, didn't they? Castle Rock meadow? Asked Nell. Yes, went down to get some more cottontails. Nell said nothing. A little breeze had sprung up and played through the pines on the hill with a sound that was like a sigh. The earth and the pines seemed very black under the starlit heavens. In the darkness, between twilight and moonrise, with the boys not returned from Castle Rock meadow, Nell and Rob were uneasy and found nothing to say. They were both glad when two dark shadows appeared on the green and Howard's voice said, Rocket's colt's been mauled again. There's not a speck of flesh left now. It hardly even smells. Maybe the mountain lion was back at it again, said Ken. We hunted around for tracks before it got dark, but we didn't see any. What about cottontails? Asked Rob. I thought you went out hunting. The boys each held up two. Well, get on up to the spring house and skin 'em and clean 'em. It's about bedtime. The boys disappeared in the direction of the spring house, and presently Rob said, Nell. There was no answer. He leaned over to look at her and saw that her head had fallen sideways as she sat reclining in the long canvas chair. She was sound asleep. It's the end of chapter 15.